Victorian fashion could literally kill you. The fashion of that time was not just uncomfortable, it was a real battlefield for beauty, where the stakes were high. Clothing items designed to emphasize status and elegance carried hidden dangers. They restricted movement, disrupted bodily functions, and contained deadly substances. This era turned women's clothing into a beautiful but dangerous cage, and the pursuit of fashion into a daily risk. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary hat could drive its owner mad, and why artificial flower factory workers lost their health en masse while creating accessories for aristocratic women. I will reveal the best-kept secret of Victorian fashion. The voluminous silhouette created by the crinoline was the main symbol of femininity and wealth in the mid-19th century. This steel hoop frame allowed the skirt to reach incredible sizes, transforming a woman into a graceful flower. The structure seemed light and airy compared to the numerous, heavy petticoats it replaced. Women could finally move their legs freely under the huge dome of the dress. However, this freedom was an illusion that concealed a new, much more serious danger. Crinolines were extremely flammable, especially when combined with the light fabrics popular at the time, such as muslin or tarlatan. Open fireplaces, candles, and gas lamps, which were common in Victorian homes, turned every room into a risk zone. A single accidental spark could instantly turn a ball gown into a burning torch. The frame created an air draft under the skirt that fanned the flames in seconds. Due to the enormous size and rigidity of the structure, a woman could not quickly throw off her burning clothes. The crinoline, a symbol of status and fashion, became a deadly trap for her. This problem was so widespread that satirical magazines of the time featured cartoons depicting women on fire. Newspapers regularly published reports of tragic incidents at balls or even at home. But fashion demanded sacrifices, and women continued to wear these dangerous structures. The size of the crinoline also created everyday problems, making simple actions almost impossible. Walking through a narrow door, getting into a carriage, or even just hugging a loved one became a real challenge. The wind could lift the light frame, putting the lady in an awkward position. The tragedy of the situation was that the danger was obvious to everyone, but it was ignored in the name of fashion. Thousands of women suffered burns because of their airy dresses. It was a silent epidemic that high society preferred not to talk about. It was not only aristocratic women who suffered, but also ordinary maids and workers. They also wore cheaper versions of crinolines and were equally at risk when working near stoves and fireplaces. Fashion made everyone equal in the face of fire. The crinoline became a striking example of how the pursuit of a certain silhouette can go too far. It demonstrated a complete disregard for practicality and safety in order to conform to the ideal of beauty. And this was just one of many fashion inventions of the era that endangered their owners. We would love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think women continued to follow such a dangerous fashion trend despite the obvious risks? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most famous item of Victorian clothing? The corset was not just an item of underwear, but the foundation of the entire female silhouette of the 19th century. It created a slim waist, lifted the bust, and formed the correct posture, which was considered a sign of noble origin. For Victorian society, the corset was a symbol of discipline, restraint, and respectability. A woman without a corset was perceived as someone of questionable morals. Girls were put into corsets from an early age, accustoming their bodies to an unnatural shape. However, behind the outward elegance lay a serious impact on the body. Tight lacing compressed the chest and abdominal cavity. This made normal breathing difficult, forcing women to breathe shallowly, using only the upper part of their lungs. Internal organs were displaced from their natural positions. The stomach, liver, and intestines were under constant pressure. This led to digestive problems and other chronic ailments. Many doctors of the time sounded the alarm, publishing articles about the negative consequences of wearing corsets. They linked this practice to fainting, weakness, and general deterioration of health in women. However, their voices were drowned out by the chorus of defenders of fashion and tradition. For the middle class, the corset was a way to imitate the aristocracy and demonstrate their status. The wife of a banker or lawyer had to look as if she did not engage in physical labor. A tightly laced corset and expensive dresses served this purpose. The working class could not afford such luxuries in their daily lives. However, many factory workers and maids wore corsets on Sundays when they went to church or for a walk. It was a way for them to feel part of respectable society. The process of tightening the corset was a daily ritual. Often, a woman needed the help of a maid to achieve the desired degree of tightness. This further emphasized the class division. An aristocrat had an assistant, while a middle-class woman managed on her own or with the help of family members. The corset physically restricted women's freedom. It was difficult to bend over, walk quickly, or lift heavy objects while wearing it. It turned women into fragile, dependent creatures, which was entirely in line with the patriarchal ideals of the era. But what if I told you that the main threat was not in the shape of the dress, but in its color? Are you ready to find out which shade of green could slowly poison its owner and those who created it? What I am about to show you was hidden behind a beautiful picture. In the mid-19th century, a new, incredibly bright and saturated shade of green came into fashion. It was called Parisian green, or emerald, and it instantly won the hearts of high society fashionistas. This color was so vivid and durable that it was used everywhere. Silk dresses for balls, satin shoes, and artificial flowers for decorating hairstyles, and hats were dyed in it. The green shade became a symbol of luxury and the latest fashion trend. However, the secret behind this beauty was terrible. Copper arsenate, a substance containing large amounts of arsenic, was used to create the pigment. This poison was an integral part of the most popular color of the era. Particles of the poisonous dye constantly separated from the fabric of the dress in the form of fine dust. They settled on the skin of the owner and entered her lungs when she breathed. Women who wore these dresses often complained of malaise, skin rashes, and nausea, unaware of the true cause. But the real victims of emerald fashion were not aristocrats, but poor working-class girls. They were the ones who worked in cramped and stuffy workshops where artificial flowers were made to decorate dresses. They inhaled toxic green dust all day long. Their working conditions were appalling. The workers, many of whom were very young, suffered from chronic arsenic poisoning. The consequences were dire. Ulcers on their hands, vision problems, and serious internal diseases. This tragedy was a striking manifestation of class inequality. The aristocracy enjoyed beauty without thinking about its price. The working class paid for this beauty with their health and lives. Doctors and public figures tried to draw attention to this problem. Articles appeared in the press describing the suffering of female workers in flower workshops. But the fashion industry and the pursuit of profit were stronger. The very fact that a symbol of beauty and wealth was literally saturated with poison is very symbolic of the entire Victorian era. The glittering facade hid dark secrets and human tragedies. The luxury of some was built on the suffering of others. Only with time, with the advent of safer aniline dyes, did Paris green go out of fashion. But thousands of lives had already been sacrificed to this beautiful and deadly shade. It was a silent war, where color was the weapon. What you are about to learn will change your perception of Victorian gentlemen. Danger lurked not only in women's dresses. Men's fashion also had its risks, and the most famous example is the process of making felt top hats. Hat makers used mercury compounds to treat the felt. This process, called kerating, made the wool softer and more pliable. However, constant contact with mercury vapors had a devastating effect on the craftsmen's nervous systems. Hats makers developed symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning, tremors in the limbs, speech problems, loss of coordination, and even mental disorders. This is where the expression "mad as a hatter" came from, which was later popularized by Lewis Carroll. Women took risks not only with their clothing, but also with their cosmetics. Aristocratic pallor was considered the ideal of beauty, symbolizing the absence of the need to work under the sun. To achieve this effect, fashionistas used powder and lead-based whitewash. Lead, absorbed through the skin, slowly poisoned the body. It caused many problems, from headaches to paralysis. But the desire to conform to the standard of beauty was stronger than the fear for one's own health. Belladonna-based eye drops were also in fashion. This plant dilated the pupils, making the eyes appear languid and mysterious. However, belladonna is poisonous and, with frequent use, could lead to serious vision problems. Even gloves were dangerous. They were often dyed with the same aniline dyes as fabrics. Contact with the skin, especially if the hands were sweaty, could cause severe allergic reactions and dermatitis. But even if clothing and accessories were not poisonous or flammable, they posed another, simpler threat. In the next chapter, you will learn about the weight that fashionistas of that era had to carry. The full outfit of a Victorian high society lady was a complex, multi-layered construction. It consisted of many elements, each of which added weight and volume. Wearing such clothes on a daily basis was a real physical challenge. It all started with underwear, a long shirt and pantaloons. Then a corset was put on, which was stiff and heavy in itself. Over the corset went a special short blouse called a bodice. Next came the petticoats. There could be up to 6 of them, made of thick cotton, linen, and sometimes even horsehair to add stiffness. These skirts created the necessary silhouette, but their total weight was enormous. Even after the invention of the crinoline, which replaced some of the petticoats, the weight of the outfit remained significant. The crinoline itself, although lighter than layers of fabric, still had a steel frame. And on top of it was the dress itself, often made of heavy materials such as velvet, brocade, or thick silk. The total weight of a full daytime outfit could reach 10 to 15 kilograms. Imagine having to carry this load from morning to night every day. This put a tremendous strain on the spine and muscles. Such clothing severely restricted movement. Women moved slowly and smoothly, not only because of etiquette, but also because they were physically unable to move otherwise. Quick steps or sudden movements were simply impossible. The weight and layers of the outfit led to overheating, especially in the summer. Combined with a tight corset that made breathing difficult, this often caused fainting. A lady fainting was a common sight at Victorian balls. For middle-class women, who had fewer servants, wearing such a costume was even more difficult. They had to do some housework, and heavy clothing was a serious hindrance. Their dresses were simpler, but the basic principle of layering remained. Working-class women, of course, could not afford such clothing for work. However, their work clothes, although simpler, were made of coarse and heavy fabrics and were far from comfortable. They could only dream of silks and lace, unaware of the price aristocratic women paid for them. Thus, fashion weighed on women not only metaphorically, forcing them to conform to strict standards, but also literally. The weight of the dress was another way to restrict their freedom, turning them into beautiful but immobile decorations for the home. What if I showed you a time machine? Victorian fashion dictated strict requirements not only for the silhouette, but also for the size of the foot. The ideal was considered to be a tiny, almost childlike foot, which forced women to wear shoes that were frankly too small for them. Boots and shoes with narrow, pointed toes and small, but often unstable heels came into fashion. They were made of leather, satin, or brocade. To make the foot appear smaller, shoes were made as narrow as possible, without regard for the anatomy of the foot. Wearing such tight shoes on a daily basis led to serious problems. It caused deformation of the toes, painful calluses, and ingrown toenails. But in order to conform to the ideal of beauty, women were willing to endure constant discomfort. Lace-up boots, or boots with lots of small buttons, were especially popular. Putting them on and taking them off was a long and laborious process, often requiring the use of a special hook. This made shoes yet another element that limited spontaneity and freedom. For upper-class women, this was tolerable, as they did not walk much, traveling mainly in carriages. However, for middle-class women, who had to move around more, such shoes became a real challenge. They had to look respectable, sacrificing their own comfort. The problem was exacerbated by the condition of the streets at that time. The pavements were uneven, dirty, and covered with rubbish. Walking on them in narrow, high-heeled shoes was not only uncomfortable, but also unsafe. The long hems of dresses caught on the ground, collecting street dirt. Women had to lift their skirts to avoid getting them dirty and tripping. This required a certain amount of skill, especially when crossing the road. Such fashionable footwear was unaffordable for the poor and working classes. They wore simple, rough boots, which were often worn out and offered little protection from the cold and damp. Ironically, however, their footwear was much healthier for their feet than the narrow shoes of the aristocrats. Thus, even footwear in the Victorian era was an instrument of social control. It emphasized status, restricted mobility, and forced women to suffer in the name of an imposed ideal. A foot encased in a narrow boot was as much a symbol of the era as a waist cinched in a corset. Someone had to create all this dangerous beauty. In the next chapter, we will leave the ballrooms and take a look at the workshops where Victorian fashion was born and where the price for it was the highest. Behind every luxurious dress and every elegant accessory was the hard work of thousands of nameless workers. Industrialization and the growth of cities led to the emergence of a huge number of factories and workshops producing clothing. Working conditions in these places were far from the romantic image of the era. Seamstresses, or as they were then called, girls with sewing needles, worked 14 to 16 hours a day in cramped, poorly lit, and unventilated rooms. For their exhausting labor, they received pennies, which were barely enough to pay for food and a corner in an overcrowded room. Such workshops were called sweatshops. Poor lighting from candles or gas lamps led to rapid deterioration of eyesight. By the age of 30, many seamstresses could no longer see properly. Constantly sitting in the same position caused spinal problems. Conditions were even worse in textile factories, where fabrics were produced. The air in the workshops was filled with cotton dust, which clogged the workers' lungs, leading to chronic diseases. The noise from the machines was so loud that many workers went deaf. In dyeing factories, workers handled toxic substances without any protection. They came into direct contact with arsenic, lead, and aniline dyes. Occupational poisoning was common. Factory owners who belonged to the upper middle class sought maximum profits. They did not care about the safety and health of their workers. Anyone who complained or was unable to work was immediately fired, as there was always a crowd of unemployed people waiting outside the gates. This stark contrast between fashion producers and consumers was the essence of Victorian society. An aristocrat discussing the latest Parisian fashions in her salon was unlikely to think about the fate of the girl who went blind embroidering patterns on her dress. The wealth and luxury of some were directly linked to the poverty and suffering of others. Fashion was not just a reflection of taste, but an entire economic system based on class inequality. And in this system, some were assigned the role of beautiful mannequins, while others were assigned the role of faceless and disenfranchised creators of that beauty. To understand the gulf between the classes, it is enough to compare the mornings of two women. The aristocrat woke up in a spacious bedroom, and her day began with the arrival of her maid. The whole process of getting dressed was a long ritual in which she took a passive part. The maid helped her put on numerous layers of clothing, tightened her corset, and fastened countless hooks and buttons on her dress. This was followed by a visit to the hairdresser, who created an elaborate hairstyle on her head. Breakfast was served in bed or in the small dining room. At the same time, long before dawn, a seamstress in the slums of the East End was waking up. Her morning began not with coffee, but with a piece of stale bread and a mug of weak tea. She had to be at work by 6 in the morning, otherwise she would face a fine or dismissal. Her entire wardrobe consisted of 1 or 2 simple dresses made of coarse fabric. She dressed herself quickly, without any rituals. Her way to work lay through dirty, crowded streets, full of poverty and despair. While the aristocrat planned her day of visits, receptions, and preparations for the evening ball, the worker was already sitting at her sewing machine. She performed monotonous work in a stuffy room, bent over the fabric from which perhaps a dress for another aristocrat was being sewn. Her working day lasted until late in the evening. In the evening, the noblewoman shone at the ball in a dress that cost more than the annual earnings of hundreds of such workers. She discussed politics, art, and gossip. Her life was filled with leisure and entertainment. The worker, on the other hand, returned home to her tiny room completely exhausted. After a meager dinner, she fell into bed to sleep for a few hours before another day just like it. Her life was an endless struggle for survival. This parallel reality was the norm in Victorian England. The luxury of the upper classes did not simply exist alongside the poverty of the lower classes. It depended directly on them. Cheap labor allowed industrialists and aristocrats to live in luxury. In this context, fashion was not just a set of clothes, but a visible embodiment of this injustice. An aristocrat's dress was a symbol of her idleness. A seamstress's work clothes were a symbol of her hard labor. Two women living in the same city existed in completely different worlds. They were separated by an invisible but insurmountable wall built of money, origin, and social status. And fashion was one of the bricks in that wall. Between the aristocracy and the working class was a large and diverse middle class. For them, fashion was not so much a matter of luxury as it was a matter of respectability. This was a key concept in Victorian society, meaning conformity to strict social norms. The upper middle class, consisting of industrialists, bankers, and successful doctors, sought to emulate the aristocracy. They built large houses, hired servants, and spent vast sums of money on clothes for their wives and daughters. Their fashion was a way of demonstrating their success and wealth. For these nouveau riches, keeping up with all the latest fashion trends was a must. Their wives wore the same tight corsets and puffy crinolines as the duchesses. It was a way of asserting their right to be in high society. The lower middle class, clerks, teachers, small traders, could not afford such luxuries. However, maintaining a respectable appearance was even more important for them. Their jobs, reputations, and the ability to marry off their daughters depended on it. Their clothes were more modest, made of cheaper materials, but they had to imitate aristocratic styles. A clerk's wife might have only one good dress, which she altered each season to fit the new fashions. A corset and several petticoats were essential. This pursuit of respectability drove many families into debt. A significant portion of their modest budget was spent on looking decent. Failure to meet standards could lead to social ostracism. Thus, fashion was a tool of pressure on all strata of society. For the aristocracy, it was a game and a demonstration of status. For the middle class, it was a heavy duty and a struggle for a place under the sun. Virtually the entire society was captive to fashion conventions. Victorian fashion was not just clothing, but a complex system of codes and symbols that regulated social relations. And it was almost impossible to go beyond the boundaries of this system. In summary, Victorian fashion was a perfect reflection of its time. It was as contradictory as the era itself, beautiful and dangerous, luxurious and cruel. Behind every elegant silhouette was a complex history of social and economic relations. For a woman of high society, fashion was a gilded cage. It emphasized her status and her husband's wealth, but deprived her of freedom of movement and damaged her health. Her body was encased in a corset, and her life was bound by a strict etiquette. For middle-class women, fashion was a tool for social struggle. They had to constantly prove their respectability, spending their last pennies on it. Their outfits were a compromise between desire and possibility. For working-class women, fashion was something distant and unattainable. They saw it in shop windows or on aristocratic women passing by. Their lot was to create this beauty in inhuman conditions, receiving pennies in return. Thus, clothing did not simply adorn or warm, but served as the uniform of one's class. A single glance at a person could determine their place in the complex social hierarchy. Fashion divided and ruled, making the barriers between classes visible and almost insurmountable. The dangers inherent in fashion, from toxic dyes to flammable skirts, were only the physical manifestation of a deeper problem. Society was built on oppression and exploitation, and this was reflected even in clothing. Women's bodies were constricted by corsets, just as society as a whole was constricted by the corset of conventions and inequality. That is why studying Victorian fashion is not just a conversation about dresses and hats. It is a conversation about social injustice, about the price of progress, and about how the suffering of millions was hidden behind the outward glamour of the empire. It is a story of how people survived in conditions where even a dress could be a threat. The Industrial Revolution brought new materials and technologies, but it also created a new form of exploitation. Factories produced not only fabrics, but also poverty. The luxurious outfits of the aristocracy were paid for with the health of nameless workers. And when we look at portraits of Victorian beauties, it is worth remembering this. Behind the perfect posture lies a tight corset. Behind the bright color of the dress, possibly arsenic. And behind all this splendor, the hard work of those who remain behind the scenes. We see that behind the elegant facade of Victorian fashion lay a world full of dangers and contradictions. Beauty demanded sacrifices, and these sacrifices were made by everyone from aristocratic women who risked their health for the sake of a perfect silhouette to factory workers who gave up their health for a piece of bread. It was an era of extremes, where luxury and poverty, progress and cruelty went hand in hand. The history of costume is a mirror that reflects society with all its values, fears, and prejudices. Victorian fashion clearly demonstrates how social inequality permeated every aspect of life, From the choice of fabric for a dress to working conditions in a factory. It is a stark reminder of the true price of elegance in the 19th century. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in another historical era or a specific aspect of the past. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.